start. Thank you, Maximo. Well, you are all welcome to this 13th session of our Congress. We'll have three presentations by Janeille Matthews from University of West Indies in first place, then Martha Vargas Aguirre from University of Ottawa, and then Mariano Sicardi and Claudio González, but I understand that Mariano will present from Claudio from University of Chile and Mariano from National University of Paz and University of Buenos Aires. You will have 20 minutes for your presentation. After the three presentations, we will have the comments of Team Newburn. We will have the honor of receiving the team comments. Hi, team. He will comment on 10 minutes. And after that, we will have time for questions and answers. The presentations will be recorded, not the discussions after that. You can do comments on Zoom chat during the presentations, so we'll maintain the parallel conversation during our presentations to the work. So I think we can begin with Janeille, if you want.
Thank you.
I think you are close. You can share your screen.
Okay. I'm not. I'm just going to speak.
Okay.
Thank you very much for having me. My paper has shifted just a little bit. I'm still working out some of the kinks, and I really hope, I look forward to your feedback today as I struggle with a bit of the conceptual frame that I had envisioned. So in Ruminations, published in her essay in the UK Guardian on what some call the racial reckoning brought on by the killings of unarmed Black people in the United States, Ghanaian author Ya Jiazi writes that the one thing she has always known for sure is that the world can change and stay exactly the same. And it's this idea, this relationship between change and stasis, with which I've been most concerned, most recently in my work on contemporary penal practices in the Anglophone Caribbean. And it's this relationship that I wish to interrogate in this paper and discuss with you today. My main goal is to do two things. One, to highlight continuities between key aspects of Caribbean penology during slavery and just after emancipation and now. And the second thing that I hope to do is to offer some thoughts on how path dependency might help us to understand these continuities and see just how the world perhaps can change and yet still stay the same. And so I come to this work from the starting point of Melanie Newton, who is a historian of the Anglophone Caribbean. And Melanie Newton has observed that in the Anglophone Caribbean, we live still with institutions and social structures that emerged in their modern form as part of the emancipation process. For example, the post-emancipation prison system, together with the infrastructure of the courts, the police, the welfare system, and elementary schools, are central institutions of modern Caribbean state power and are amongst the most enduring legacies of emancipation. So what does that mean? It means that across the region, we still enforce criminal laws from the 1800s, including vagrancy laws. It means that corporal punishment in many jurisdictions still persists. It means that in Antigua and Barbuda, our sole prison is affectionately called 1735 because that was the year that it was built, and very, very little has changed even to the structure of it today. And so what does this have to do with what I want to talk about? My work is grounded in a historicism that I think is often lost in conversations of contemporary penal practices in the Anglophone Caribbean. In my subtitle, I say re-historicizing, because while we already have a rich body of post-colonial thought in the region, with few exceptions, we tend not to draw on that body of literature as lawyers, which I am one, and criminal justice practitioners when it comes to thinking about modern day punishment. So we talk about post-coloniality in many other disciplines, from anthropology, sociology, even in speaking about the legacy of certain laws like vagrancy laws, but we tend not to draw on that kind of understanding when we're talking about prisons. And in fact, prisons are scantily discussed. Punishment is not very much discussed in the region. It's just sort of taken for granted. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But I believe that there are continuities between our penology during slavery and colonialism and our penology now. And I very much rely on the work of historians of the Anglophone Caribbean to assist me in connecting those dots. For example, in their archival work on the history of the prison system in Guyana, Claire Anderson, Melissa Eiffel, and their co-authors highlight key themes pertaining to overcrowding, incarceration for minor offenses, poor prison conditions, and the dearth of meaningful rehabilitation that persist even now. Similarly, Diana Payton provides a rich historical account of penal practices in Jamaica that are reminiscent of contemporary times. And so I see my work as building on these historical insights, mainly Payton's observation that prisons in slave societies served a very different purpose than prisons in free societies. Looking at Jamaica's pre-emancipation prison population, Payton notes that unlike the prison populations in Britain and elsewhere, in Jamaica, prisons included large numbers of people who were committed without judicial procedures. The majority of prisoners were sentenced to a life term when the longest prison sentence in Britain at the time was 3 years. So there was a punitiveness that characterized prisons in slave societies. According to Payton, prisons and slave societies worked through the principle of less eligibility, that the conditions of penal institutions had to be worse than the conditions of the poorest person outside the institution, or else people would opt in to incarceration to access better conditions. In the UK and elsewhere, prison was about deprivation of freedom, but deprivation of freedom meant nothing, I'm sorry, my son is here, to people who weren't free. So it had to be about more than depriving unfree people of something they never had. Similarly, the idea of reforming or rehabilitating an inmate's character or soul made little sense in a society that denied their very personhood. So what is striking to me, what is most striking to me, is just how durable our penal institutions have been. And I see a number of parallels. The Inter-American Development Bank recently conducted a study of 6 Anglophone Caribbean countries, which provides more evidence than we have ever had in respect of prisons and the way in which they're run and who is actually incarcerated. And what that IDB study showed is that in many respects, not very much has changed. So if we recall Payton's finding that prisons included large numbers of people who were committed without judicial procedures, according to the data, approximately 50% or more of the total prison population in 3 of the 6 countries, and between 23 and 42% in the remaining countries, is comprised of persons who have not yet been convicted, many of whom are first-time offenders and or committed nonviolent offenses. In many cases, inmates on remand, not convicted, are serving lengthy sentences. And I say serving because they are sometimes waiting longer for trial than the time they would have gotten if convicted. And because they're on remand, they don't have access to any of the modest rehabilitative programs that might exist or any of the benefits that would actually attach with a conviction. If we recall Peyton's articulation of less eligibility across the region, even today in many prisons, the conditions are still very harsh. There are high rates of violence, with many inmates having either been victimized or witnessed others being victimized. Of the 6 countries in the IDB study, with the exception of Barbados, most prisons are overcrowded or very close to their capacity. I recall Anderson and her co-authors' findings that in 3 main areas, there's continuity with the past: sentencing, overcrowding, and limited resources for training and rehabilitation. The scholars explain that even now, in most cases, courts continue to ignore the effects of their sentencing decisions, failing to consider the capacity of the jail. Moreover, they argue that overcrowding has been a troubling characteristic since the 19th century, and note harsh and potentially life-threatening conditions that persist to this day. My own work suggests similar findings in Antigua and Barbuda, which has some of the poorest prison conditions in the region. In Antigua's prison, for example, 14 inmates are routinely housed in cells designed for 6. Inmates use slop pails instead of toilets. Poor ventilation leads to stifling cell temperatures. And there is a kitchen with insects, raw meat on the ground, stray cats, and an overwhelmingly unpleasant odor. And what all the research suggests across the region is that rehabilitation and training is very much an afterthought, despite stated intentions. There's just nothing that's happening in a very meaningful way, nor is there the political will to make it happen, with the exception of perhaps Guyana. But when there are limited resources, even the best laid plans aren't necessarily helpful. And so I don't have very much time to discuss it, but I engaged in a newspaper analysis and a frame analysis of public discourse in Antigua and Barbuda. And like Melanie Newton, I think it is difficult not to hear the echo of elitist, racist, post-slavery discourse in the pro-incarceration policies of contemporary Caribbean state officials and in the views of members of the public. In Trinidad and Tobago, for example, the police commissioner refers to criminals as cockroaches and speaks in the language of war, advocating one-shot kill. I worked on the Rwanda Tribunal, and that's the language of genocide. But it's also the language that shaped a historical reality in which Black lives never really mattered. But yet that is the road we continue down. So that brings me to the second part of what I wanted to discuss. What do we make of these parallels? If we have a better understanding of why they exist, I think then we would have a better chance of disrupting the pattern. And here's where I think that a basic understanding of path dependence might be useful in helping us to connect to different points of time. And so in its modern conception, path dependence can be traced back to the field of economics through the work of Brian Arthur and Paul David, who used the configuration of the QWERTY typewriter keyboard to show how the timing of the configuration converged with the advent of touch typing in a way that just set off a chain of events that ultimately led to all of us using the QWERTY configuration now, even though it might not be the most efficient or the most useful. But in its broadest sociological understanding, I think path dependence is premised on this notion that history matters, that an understanding of the past is critical to any understanding of the present, because historical factors can set directions and shape conditions that have long-term influence over institutions, technologies, markets, industries, and nations. And my intention is not to suggests that path dependence is the sole explanation for the durability of these institutions. I don't want to simplify it in that way, but I do think that it might be a useful theoretical framework to understand how we have come to take our current methods of punishment for granted. And honestly, this is the bit that I struggle with, because I do think that it's far more nuanced than simply saying, well, there was slavery, there was colonial rule, and that just sent us down a path that is irreversible. I think that, I think it's also connected with this idea of modernity, and that these enduring legacies are connected to what Sidney Mintz has termed a modernity that predated the modern. So it's this idea that slavery and forced transportation had a modernizing effect on Caribbean cultures, which had to develop under these, unusual and horrific conditions. The way that David Scott says it is that the Caribbean as we know it, created through its colonial encounter, was precociously and paradoxically modern. Precocious because what we call modern as a structuring form had not yet materialized in Europe, and paradoxical because it was completely unanticipated and unnoticed that such people brought in chains from Africa might embody the coming future. What I mean to suggest is that we inherited or maybe forged institutions that were ahead of their time. And here I echo C.L.R. James's claim that Black slaves on plantations, for example, in the Caribbean were closer to a modern proletariat than any group of workers in existence at the time. And I think of Peyton's reminder of the widespread acceptance of interpretations of the plantation as the prototype of modern industrial production. And so similarly, in that vein, I take her point that Jamaican prisons ought not to be relegated to this designation of pre-modern, but to be thought of as a modern institution. So part, I think, of what helps these institutions or what helps the prison to endure is the fact that they were they were ahead of their time. And so they were modern from very early on, and didn't really have to change as, they gained the concept of the modern prison sort of gained worldwide acceptance and popularity. And it sort of became a locked in aspect at that point of Caribbean society, one that's just taken for granted. And so I think that understanding how or why it's taken for granted, that we can't conceive of any other way in which to punish people, has limited our imagination and constrained decisions that have made any sort of meaningful penal reform futile. To sort of go back to the title or the subtitle of my paper, which I have titled A History of Now, Rehistoricizing Contemporary Penal Practices in the Anglophone Caribbean. I don't think I think that it's not until we rehistoricize our contemporary penal practices that we have a better understanding of where we are and how we got here. I think it's only then that we'll have the freedom to radically reimagine new systems of accountability and punishment in the Anglophone Caribbean, which might not even include prisons at all, perhaps, and fully then engage with the project of decolonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janeille, for your presentation. Martha, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully there's not gonna be a problem with that. So can you see my screen? I don't know. That's right. Okay, thank you. Well, criminological research, mainly in the Anglo-Saxon academic scene, has studied the exponential increase in incarceration rates in several Western countries since that took place during the last decades of the 20th century. And many of these studies estimate that this phenomenon responds to a sudden and draconian metamorphosis in the logic underlying the practices and discourses in the penal realm. And they have denominated this phenomenon as the punitive turn. Therefore, Canadian criminologist Carrière called these research endeavors as the sociologies of the punitive turn. Following this theorization, I question if it's possible to identify a punitive turn in a context like the Latin American one. And for this, I chose the case of Ecuador. And I posit that we can indeed find some similarities to what is described by these theorists. However, the theory of the punitive turn is insufficient to account for what happened in a context like the Ecuadorian one. But before we dive into these aspects, we must briefly review the theorizations developed by these sociologies of the punitive turn. So, okay, so the sociologies of the punitive turn share a basic premise, which is the development of a rapid and dramatic change in the field of criminal enforcement linked to the implementation of neoliberalism. Carrière states that these studies identify three main symptoms of this contemporary dynamic. And the first one is related to the continuous and expansive increase in prison population. The second one is linked to the development of post-disciplinary control. And finally, the third symptom is related to the use of criminality as a center of political expression. This shift will have led to an unprecedented growth in the punitive nature of criminal policies that target the most fragile social groups in society, particularly in core countries. In this vein, this phenomenon will not only be limited to the European and American and North American context, but it would also encompass other regions like Latin America. And indeed, the implementation of neoliberalism in this region also overlaps with an unprecedented growth in its imprisonment rates, resembling to what is described and theorized by the sociologists of the punitive turn. However, we have to consider that crime control and punishment are defined by the specificities of the context where they are developed. And therefore, to understand the transformation in the repression field that took place in a context like Ecuador, in the aftermath of neoliberalism implementation, we must go beyond what the arguments of the sociologists of the punitive turn say. Hence, we need to pay attention to the particularities of the process that enabled these changes. And in this vein, it must be considered that the dynamics of neoliberalism implementation and its subsequent consequences in this country do not respond to the same patterns of the core countries. So in this frame, Latin America opened the doors to neoliberalism within a framework of economic dependence on the United States. And the relations of this region of the world with this North American country have been long characterized by imperialist dynamics in their various forms. Consequently, the transformation in the Ecuadorian punitive realm cannot be fully understood without observing these dynamics of imperial control that characterize the relations of these core countries with the periphery. So if we analyze the demographic profiles of incarceration starting in the 1990s, the decade in which the rate of incarceration began to grow exponentially in Ecuador, we can see that the most predominant cases are drug-related offenses, in contrast to previous decades where crimes against property were those with the highest incidence. Thus, observing this trend, we can think that the increase in the punitive trends in Ecuador should be studied within the frame of the anti-drug policy implemented at this time in Ecuador, which is linked to the war on drugs enacted by the United States. So until 1990, Ecuador kept its distance from this policy because it did not feel concerned by the United States interests, as the country was not a producer of these substances, but mainly a transit territory. However, the United States considered that these Andean countries should form part of this fight to prevent it from becoming an economy dependent on drugs. In this context, in 1991, Ecuador signed the Andean Trade Preference Act, or ATPA, with the United States. And the goal was to promote legal production in Andean countries to avoid the proliferation of illegal drug economies. Hence, certain products exported to the United States from the Andean countries of Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru would receive a duty-free exemption. The ATPA agreement came to an end in December 2011, but it was subsequently renewed through the Andean Trade Promotion Drug Eradication Agreement, or ATPDEA, which was enforced until July 2013. In the case of Ecuador, the main destination of most of its exports is the United States. So the signing of a trade agreement of this type was considered an important strategic move for this country's economy. So under these treaties, 6,900 Andean products were part of this exemption. Thus, these treaties meant that the Andean countries will be able to enter the USA market more easily. This agreement sought to improve Ecuador's economy, and although there were indeed certain benefits for Ecuador exports, the tariff preferences did not bring the expected benefits. So throughout the duration of these agreements, the United States had control over the entry of products into its market, and Ecuador did not achieve the expected economic diversification. It did not cease to be an economy dependent on primary product exports. Likewise, there was no significant impact on the reduction of social inequality and poverty in this country as expected. And these type of bilateral agreements, as well as free trade agreements, have allowed the United States to penetrate markets like the Latin American ones more easily, facilitating the control of the strategic sectors and promoting policies that support the interests of transnationals. In this sense, the ATPDA and ATPDEA agreements are one of the mechanisms through which economic imperialism expands. And this is the dynamic that prevails between countries like the States with a high capacity for generation, integration, and technological development, and those like Ecuador, whose economies depend on the exports of raw material to the economic systems of the center. So Ecuador's economy dependence on the United States and the dynamics of economic imperialism that sustained it have been a long-standing constant in this country, and the Andean preference agreements are just one more expression of it. It has been determined that imperialism is not only limited to the economic aspect, but it can also extend to other areas such as communication, the military realm, migration regulation, resulting in various forms of imperialism that can act in an intertwined manner. In this framework, the Andean preference treaties are expressions of economic imperialism in Andean countries such as Ecuador, and they foster Ecuador's economic dependence on the United States. However, the basis on which these agreements are based, which is the fight against drug trafficking, means that these trade instruments also introduce imperialist dynamics that extend to the criminal justice system of this country. In other words, these tariff preference treaties would make possible the extension of a punitive imperialism. And in this vein, I draw from Barker's concept, who I have the chance to meet in this session. She coined the concept of penal imperialism, which described the power dynamics that define border politics. And I posit that Ecuador's inscription in the war on drugs policy is the outcome of the same logic. Therefore, the ATPDA and the ATPDE agreements were mechanisms through which a country like the USA extended its rule outside its nation state boundaries. So Barker claims that penal imperialism is an expression of penal power, which is deep-seated in colonizing dynamics, relies on military power, and operates in transnational space. So following this line of thought, I estimate that Barker's description not only illustrates the reality of border regimes, but it can also be clearly identified in the dynamics that define criminal policy transfer between core countries like the States and periphery nations like Ecuador. However, as I am not analyzing border crossing regulation, I estimate that in this particular context, the word punitive will describe better the dependency and domination relation guiding these agreements, as well as the transformation in the criminal justice system that took place during the 19th and the 2010s. Why? Because the word punitive comes from the Latin word punire, which means to inflict penalty on. This concept does not only refer to forms of direct punishment related to the criminal realm, but it also describes troublesome consequences related to certain actions or omissions. Therefore, in the case of the relation between Ecuador and the United States, the troublesome consequences were not only limited to the penal realm through drug enforcement criminal policy, but they also extended to the potential suspension of or cancellation of these economic agreements if Ecuador did not comply with the USA requirements. Hence, as the consequences are not limited to the criminal punishment, but they extend to economic sphere, I consider that punitive imperialism captures the dynamics that took place in this country. So within the framework of ATPDA and ATPDE agreements, Ecuador had to provide its full collaboration with the war on drugs, and to do so, it had to prove to the United States that a 10% annual increase in the number of drugs that were seized, 50% increase in the number of weapons and chemical products seized, and a 12% increase in the number of judicial processes related to drug trafficking. So to meet this objective, Ecuador implemented legislative changes. Hence, this Andean country enacted the law on narcotraffics and psychotropic substances, better known as Law 108. This legal instrument was considered one of the most severe laws against drug trafficking of the region. And due to the pressure from the United States, the process of enactment of Law 108 was rushed. Hence, this legal instrument lacked proper structure, and it did not respond to the reality of a country whose role at that time was limited to transit. Before the enactment of Law 108, Ecuador had a drug legislation that was focused on prevention, and drugs were considered as a public health issue. And the introduction of Law 108 completely changed this panorama. It should be noted that after Law 108 was approved by the Ecuadorian Congress, it was submitted for approval of the Narcotics Affairs section of the United States. Therefore, this country not only defined the basis for the trade cooperation, but it also approved the development of foreign legislation as a means of safeguarding its interests. And this dynamic exposes the subordinate relationship that Ecuador has with the United States and how punitive imperialism operates. Through Law 108, Ecuador adopted a widespread practice in the USA criminal system, which is mandatory minimum penalties. In this context, all drug offenses were punished with a minimum sentence of 10 years of imprisonment. Consequently, all offenders, regardless of the seriousness of the crime, were judged in the same way, including drug users and micro traffickers. So drug use was thus assimilated to the most serious offenses in the penal code at that time, and a user could receive 10 years in prison, an unreasonable penalty in a country where homicide was punished by 16 years at that time. As I previously mentioned, at the time that these agreements were signed, Ecuador was mainly a transit country. So drug trade within the country was mainly a small-scale informal activity. Therefore, in the absence of intense drug-related criminality, the pressure to comply with the USA conditions meant that much of Ecuador's drug enforcement efforts were concentrated on criminalizing minority dealers from the most vulnerable social groups. In conclusion, when we analyze how the war on drugs permeated Ecuadorian criminal policy, we should first consider that at the time of its implementation, this country was not yet seriously affected by large-scale drug trafficking. Nevertheless, it adopted the USA guidelines to combat these problems through an extremely severe legislation, which was out of step with reality. And the introduction of this made in USA punitive logic responded to the economic pressure exerted through the conditions of the ATPDA and ATPDE agreements. The imperialist dynamics that defined the economic relationship between the United States and Ecuador were extended to the punitive realm. Consequently, the war on drugs policies were transferred to Ecuador in the frame of punitive imperialism. Hence, a country like the United States extended its rule over a foreign society, not only through economic dependency, but through criminal policy transfer. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martha, for your presentation. And Mariano?
Hi, hi everyone. I'm starting to share my screen. Can you hear me well? Yes, great. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Luis and Maximo and all the staff of the University of Oxford for organizing this amazing workshop. Claudio couldn't be here. He's giving a class, but he sends greeting for everyone. So before I start, I think our presentation is more a theoretical one rather than empirical, but it fits in what we have been discussing through the past 3 days, because we are trying to think about the troubles of some key concepts in the last quarter of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, of transformation in criminal justice system from the global north, and how it was used to understand mutation and changes in the criminal justice system in Latin America. We depart, even though we won't discuss this at this moment, I think we are aware of what we were discussing in the previous session about in the chat about the importance of be aware of and not take for granted about all the concepts that people scholars in the global north create and use to understand criminal justice system, and not use it critically in the global south. So basically, in our paper, we aim to trace how the trialism and managerialism theoretical frameworks have been introduced within the Latin American scientific debate, try to understand their operation in our particular context. So we will try to describe both contribution and its roles in the global north, how it travels to the global south scholarship in crime control and criminal justice system, and trace the path that it took, not only to contrast them, but also to map the theoretical and empirical routes. Even though in our title we put Latin America, we were working on this presentation, we finally frame our research to Argentina and Chile. However, I won't say any reference to the Spanish case, but in our paper we also address the Spanish situation because of its development in this matter. But now I will focus in the Argentinian and Chilean case. So, as you all may know, I mean, actuarialism and specifically or new penology, as sorry, I have the meet section right. Starting with a seminal work of Phil and Simon in 1992. Over the last decades, the criminological field has experienced the emergence of new paths in the criminal justice system. Besides of the crisis of the welfare penal complex, have diminished rehabilitation ideas and shaped criminal justice institutions with the incorporation of new programs and initiatives among crime, justice, and crime prevention. Therefore, new penology and actuarial justice, as Malcolm Feely and Jonathan Simon defined it, implies a new kind of language in the penal and criminological realm relating to actual consideration of aggregates and techniques to identify, classify, and manage populations targeted as dangerous. After the presentation of these ideas, several critiques raised to Feely and Simon works, both theoretical or empirical. For example, Galland suggests that actual ideas are not novel. They were already present in the eugenics movement, but empirically, also some authors argue that new penology and actuarialism have not been deployed on the ground by frontline actors. But however, other scholars like Bernard Court, Kelly Moffat, and other ones argue that statistical methods and risk assessment tools are deeply embedded in actuarial techniques. So this is this is referred to the actuarialism. On the other hand, we will try to make a dialogue with managerial idea. What is managerialism? Well, managerialism was present, according to all the scholarship, in criminal justice system administration with three distinct aspects. For one part, a systemic aspect, this idea of interagency cooperation, overall strategic plan, key performance indicator, a consumerist also aspect that implies the displacement of management needs from private sector to public sector, but also
Mariano,
sí.
Disculpa que te interrumpa. ¿Sabes que se escucha bastante inestable? Tal vez está un poco lejos del micrófono.
Puede ser que ahí.
Mucho mejor.
It's good because
yes, quite better.
Just a little. Wait a minute, because I heard someone, and I don't know if my baby just pulled off the cable of the internet. No. Wait a minute, huh?
And now we are hearing you better.
Okay, ready. I thought it was the problem with the bandwidth. But well, resuming, for the purpose of our work, we understand actualism and managerialism as two distinct concepts. But however, we believe that while actualism is relies on risk assessment techniques that underpin correctional policies, and it's closely related to new penology's ideas, and we define managerialism as a set of techniques and practices which aim to fracture and realign relations of power within the criminal justice system to transform the structure and reorganize the processes for both finding and delivering criminal justice with the use of private sector ideas. We also think that there is a merge, or there could be like there is a relationship between actuarialism and managerialism, and it's embedded in the idea of efficiency and effectiveness. So the threat, in our point of view, one of our claims is that the theoretical and empirical claims of numerology and actuarialism and managerialism have both these common and distinctive features as well. Although they have different approaches and starting points, both narratives converge in the importance of efficiency and effectiveness for the criminal justice. So this is important for us because in the next section we will discuss this implication to understand how they were used by the Latin American criminological realm, trying to get inside the discussion of the troubles of the criminal question, but also the ideas of Southern criminology. But in this regard, we would like to say that
I still hear it very badly. I don't know if it's only me.
Okay, I will go more close to the now.
Yeah, but it's like dirty sound.
But I think when you are closer, it's a bit better.
This close? Okay. So previous research has shown, as Maximo has shown in previous research, that the troubles of the criminal question could be seen in Enlightenment ideas on punishment and criminological positivism from Europe to Latin America. But also critical criminology scholars back in the 70s and in the 80s from Latin America also highlight the need to be careful about mere translation or importation of concepts and theories from the global north to the global south. More here in time, Maximo challenged the idea of the neoliberal penalty thesis in some scenarios in Latin America. Therefore, we frame our analysis within the Southern criminology debate in order to challenge the use of northern theories of crime or punishment in our context. But we also use Maximo's approach to understand the troubles of actuarial and managerial ideas. Therefore, we will suggest that the trouble of actuarial and managerial theoretical frameworks from global north to Latin American comprise either criminological adoption, rejection, or complementation of ideas and concepts. So, for the purpose of our work, we construct an ideal model of 4 categories by which we can understand adaptations, rejections, or modification of our core theories, actuarialism and managerialism. Therefore, in our research, we found that scholars can frame their research on crime control policies, on criminal justice system, or reform of criminal justice in these 4 categories by framing these policies or reforms in pure actuarial or pure managerial, that implies the adoption of actuarial managerial ideas from the global north in the global south context, specifically in Chile and Argentina. Actuarial managerial, by which authors try to merge one of more features of both managerial and actuarial theories within Latin American criminal justice. And finally, an idea that we find here is like adapted actuarialism. That implies the complementation of ideas and concepts from the global north to the specific features in Latin America. As we have this, we point here some examples of how these ideas were different objects of research were framed with different approaches of those categories. For example, Both managerial and actuarial discourses and narratives traveled to the global south, but acquiring different interpretation. For example, in the metamorphosis of the actuarial approaches to criminal courts, disposition and plea bargaining, we can see this, where plea bargaining was, for some scholars, was seen as an actuarial tool, but not relying in risk assessment ideas, rather than instead of the idea of efficiency and effectiveness for the criminal court and criminal court actors. Also for policing ideas, where actuarial techniques were adapted in a more pure form to understand how in a narrative and the discourses of some policing ideas were present actuarial techniques or ideas of risk assessment. However, there is another of our claims is that there is not a linear linkage between procedural reform, for example, the efficiency and effectiveness, and the criminal justice system itself. For example, despite the introduction of plea bargaining in Argentina, for example, the lack of transparency and inefficiency is a common feature among the different criminal courts in Argentina. So the actuarial framework is not enough to understand this feature of criminal courts. On the other hand, actuarial techniques in policing for some local contexts in Argentina seems to collide with empirical research that highlighted routinely frequently violent but mostly boredom action in frontline police officers, very far of the idea of targeting population as aggregate. Finally, we will suggest that the difference between the global north and the global south, at least for our scenarios, suggests that mere transplantation of ideas and concepts is not possible. Both managerial and actuarial discourses and narratives travel to the global south, but acquiring different interpretations, as I have said before. So we will suggest that there was a travel from the global north to the global south, both in Chile and in Argentina. In Argentina, the criminal justice reform, for example, is more framed by actuarial techniques than managerial. And that's not what happened, for example, in Chile, where the actuarial techniques are more in-depth in policing and crime control policies, while the criminal justice reforms are framed by the managerial and the broader state reform. But we also would like to suggest, at the beginning, we are still working on this. We think that there could be actuarialism without managerialism, or managerialism without actuarialism. And it's not one or another can coexist with without the other one. But one of our major claims here is we need to try to reach out the empirical moment, and not only about the narrative and to the level the discourse. So, because there could be some divergences between these actuarial narratives in crime control and what the micro level policies reflect. And finally, to conclude, I would like to say that during the last years, some actuarial techniques can be seen, or at least in a very embryonic moment, in specific cases. For example, in Argentina, the use of risk assessment tool is used for domestic gender violence, and also in Chile's policing, some policing techniques and crime control techniques as well are using risk assessment tool to this purpose. So thank you so much. I'm sorry for the problems with the audio. I don't know what to say with all the technological features.
Thank you very much, Mariano, for the presentation. And then we have 10 minutes of team comments.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure I'll take the full 10 minutes, but that said, those of you like Gonzalo who are used to me teaching probably means I'll take 20. No, I promise not to. Look, it's my thanks to the organisers first and foremost for the invitation. I'm really pleased to have had an opportunity to hear these papers and to be a part of this afternoon. And I very much enjoyed all the presentations. I'm really sorry that Mariano had problems with technology, but dealt with it extremely well under the circumstances. Look, I'm going to keep my comments fairly general. I'm not going to go quite in the order in which the papers went, just because I think it'll work better for me to organise my comments in a slightly different order. We'll see if that works. The two of the papers I was able to read, I wasn't unfortunately able to read Janeille's paper before it was delivered, but it was a very clear presentation. So I hope I'm very poor at listening to papers and picking up things. So forgive me, Janeille, if I get anything wrong, if I misinterpret anything, it's entirely down to me and my kind of limited capacity to take on things hourly. These are three fascinating papers, I think, which speak to each other in a variety of ways and speak to many of the concerns of, what broadly we're thinking about these days as Southern criminology and the relationships between knowledges and practices in the global South and the global North. In terms of the paper on the contemporary Caribbean, a couple of comments on this were the two threads in the paper which I thought were really interesting. The first one, which was about, as it were, continuities and historicisation. So there I thought the kind of the general observation being made about, as it were, the relationship between 18th and 19th century practices and ideas and what we see today in the late 20th, early 21st century is important. And more generally, I think the observation about historicising or rehistoricising the ways in which we think about the practice of punishment has, of course, much wider applicability. I mean, it's just as pertinent an observation about the global North and the way in which we theorise punishment in the global North as it is anywhere else. The tendency to talk about contemporary practices in a largely ahistorical way, albeit that there are very significant exceptions to this as a practice, is still rather typical, I think, in criminology. And so embedding the way in which we think about and understand these things in their historical context is enormously important. And I thought the general point then being made about the context of slave societies picks up on, I'm sure this phrase has come up many times already in the past 3 days. I'm sorry I've not been present, but speaks to what Dario Malossi would call the cultural embeddedness of social control or punishment. And I thought the notion of cultural embeddedness ran through all three of these papers in different ways, and was something which is worthy of exploration in a variety of ways. I was struck in relation to historicisation by the title of the paper. The title of the paper was "The History of Now," which I'm assuming is a rather knowing, at least slight reference to Foucault's Histories of the Present. For that seemed very much to be, as it were, not explicit, but nonetheless a kind of the implicit approach that was being taken to understanding, in this case, the impact of past dependencies, if we want to think about them in those ways. But I'll finish with one point about past dependency, which I thought the point was very well made. But but thinking about the contemporary Caribbean in this case made me wonder about variation. And the word variation is something I'm going to come back to probably in relation to all the papers. But to the extent that one can see resonances of historical institutions and practices in the contemporary, I imagine, of course, as you were kind of alluding to, one can see quite significant variation in the ways in which those things play out in different jurisdictions and at different times, which raises some very interesting questions, of course, of why. Why and how do those things play out in different ways in different jurisdictions within, in this case, broadly speaking, the same part of the world and roughly at the same time in history. But if I can move kind of quickly on to Mariano's paper, which I think raises, again, interesting questions about actuarialism and managerialism, conceptually, practically, and the intersection between those two things, and therefore how these ideas, which were conjured up initially associated with practices in Anglophone countries and in the first instance in the global north, then travel. And what happens to them, which seems to be the crucial thing in the process of travel. Now that spoke to me here of a literature which is not yet much touched criminology, but which I think is very important, which is the critique of sort of policy transfer, of the political science concepts of policy transfer by the kind of social and human geographers, Jamie Peck et al. Not a body of work in some respects which I have entire sympathy with, but they, largely because I think there's something of a straw man in the critique, but nonetheless, the really important point that I think that they make in seeking to, as it were, to distance themselves from traditional political science in this context is about how things change as they move, and how they change the situations and the circumstances and the places across which they move. And that, I think, speaks very much to this paper and to how we might think about and understand actuarialism and managerialism in this regard, because what seemed to be being taught about, if I have it right, was the sort of the partial spread of these ideas linked to the kind of the limited utility and the limited applicability of those kinds of ideas in these, as it were, in inverted commas, new contexts. But it raised for me then a series of questions about the relationship between conceptual ideas and policy instruments. Do ideas travel? Can ideas travel in the absence of policy change? And can policy change occur in the absence of the movement of conceptual instruments? And what's the relationship between those two things? They're slightly rhetorical questions, but nonetheless, I thought there was more to be said about, as it was sort of crudely put, policy change on the one hand, and sort of conceptual shifts on the other, and their applicability or not. But then in terms of narratives, I think there's also a separation to be made, probably on a number of levels. But narratives, there's, on the one hand, what's being talked about here are criminological narratives, the new penology, Malcolm Feely and Jonathan Simon and so forth, and what happens to those kinds of ideas. But then there's also political narratives. How are those things talked about in other domains? And what's the relationship between those two things? And then two final points. One of which was, although this was kind of picked up on, I was left with a question about what's being compared. What in the shifts here, the word pure was used a couple of times, and I wondered what the model was of actuarialism or managerialism against which their usage and or practices in in Argentina or elsewhere were being compared. Is this particular practices and particular ideas, or is this against some ideal type? I guess, and I took it probably to be the latter, but I think possibly there's some more explication there that would be helpful. And then finally, a kind of fairly obvious point, which was all of this raised for me then the wider context in which these things occur, which is how do the differences that are being discussed relate to wider questions of political economy, and more particularly to the extent that one's talking about, as it were, actually existing neoliberalism, in inverted commas, how these things relate to varieties of actually existing neoliberalism. It's an unfair comment on one, though it's a different paper, but nonetheless, it provoked me to think about it, which is the important point. And then let me finish with Martha's paper, which really provoked me in a whole number of ways, not least because at the heart of it there is the most fascinating story, and a story with which I personally wasn't familiar, others maybe partly perhaps, but it came completely new to me. This on one level rather simple story, but nonetheless intriguing and important for that. A simple story about the war on drugs and the relationship between, in this case, the United States and 4 Latin American countries, Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador. It's a story essentially, as was said, I think, of imperialism. And we could have something of a debate about punitive imperialism, but nonetheless, but it's a story of the war on drugs and a story of exchange, very much one-sided exchange, and very different, and a huge power imbalance, but an exchange nonetheless. Essentially, the offer of the removal of tariffs for certain goods, and the opportunity for greater, at least in principle, exploitation of the massive US market in return for, on the one hand, restrictions on the growth of coca, and on the other, most fascinating, a series then of other changes related to penal policy. As I say, it provoked me enough then to go and look at these trade agreements and stories about them, because I was excuse me, I was so intrigued to know more. So it's not all one way. Of course, the impacts are massively disproportionate, but interestingly, it seems that as a result of the free trade agreements, one of the collateral consequences, if you like, in the United States has been the decimation, and you'll be fascinated by this, no doubt, of its asparagus industry. The dominance now of Peruvian asparagus in the US market, because it can be grown all year and exported and so forth, has had a dramatic effect on industries in California and various parts of the US, which is kind of minor coda, but nonetheless, the other way around, the dramatic impact in this case in Ecuador on from the imposition effectively of mandatory minimum penalties, massive changes to judicial processes and instruments, significant changes, it seems, to the operation of the burden of proof in the Ecuadorian justice system, and on we go. Where it left me, though, in this was wondering. So I think it's a great paper. I thought it was a fascinating story. But I wondered one thing about its presentation, and that was, and in a sense, this linked to thoughts I had more generally, which was the setup, because the setup for the paper begins with the literature on, as it were, the punitive turn, and the ideas of neoliberal penality and so forth. And yet it didn't really seem to be almost, I mean, straw man is the wrong word, but it seemed to me partly, it's an interesting starting point, but not necessarily the right one, I think, in that what all of these stories were telling in different ways, the 3 papers, was at least partly, as it were, the inapplicability and inappropriateness of literatures and terminologies and concepts and so forth derived from the global north, and then imposed or utilized, borrowed and imposed elsewhere. this last paper, it seemed to me, was much more a story of international relations and coercive policy mobility, around which I think there is a really interesting literature, and to which this speaks very, very directly. So although I think one can use, as it were, the more traditional criminological literature as a jumping off point, I'm not sure that it works as well as thinking about this for what it actually is, which, to go to the title, is punitive imperialism. But punitive imperialism and soft and hard US power and the relationships between nation states and the use of coercion, I think speaks to different literatures. But bravo everyone, I enjoyed the papers a huge amount, and that's more than enough from me. Thank you.